Hi everyone, Teja here. This is my first ever video on YouTube that I'm making. So a little bit about myself. I lived in US for over 10 years and I moved to Canada last year as a permanent resident. I keep getting a lot of questions from my friends, from my family members, and also I keep seeing on a lot of immigration sites about people asking about why should I move to Canada? Or what are the advantages or disadvantages of living in US on H1 versus living in Canada on a PR? So as a person who lived in both these countries, 10 years in US and 1 year in Canada, I think I have some perspectives on both of these. So this video is about explaining from my point of view about what are the pros and cons of living in US on an H1 versus living in Canada as a PR, and whether you should move to Canada if you're already in US, or if you're a new student coming deciding to come to US or Canada, what should you choose? So here we go. About myself. So a little bit about myself now. I lived in US over 10 years. So I moved to US in 2008 on a student visa, and I got my master's degree from Georgia Tech. And I applied for jobs just like everyone. I got a job at University of Chicago in a hospital, and I worked in that hospital on my student visa, which is OPT after my master's for a year, and then I switched to H1 and I worked on H1 for 8 years, so in total of 9 years almost. And last year I decided to move to Canada. So how is life on H1 in US, especially from the immigration standpoint, right? So again, so as a student, when once you come to US on a student visa, you have what you call an OPT, right? So you have 1 year of OPT to start with, and then you can extend that for 2 more years if your degree is in STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So mine was in science. So if you fall under any of these categories, you can extend it for 2 more years. But after the 3 years, you have to apply for an H1, right? So H1B visa, commonly known as the work visa, which is commonly known as H1B. So you cannot apply it by yourself. Your employer has to sponsor H1B for you. So the way that it goes is if your employer is a profit employer, for profit employer, for example, a company, right? So which makes profits. So you have what you call an H1B cap. So you have around 85,000 per year H1s. Out of those, 20,000 are reserved for masters students with master's degree, and the 60,000 are for everyone else, like people with bachelors, etc. Right. So if you are working for a company, a for-profit company, you would have to go through this lottery system because there's only 85,000 H1 visa available every year, and there's a lot more than 85,000 people applying for H1s every year. There is usually a lottery to see who gets within this 85,000 quota, right? So in the lottery, as you know, it's totally random. You would not know whether you're going to get it or not until after you applied and you wait for a month or two, I think. So in my case, I work for a hospital, which is a non-profit entity. So we have what you call a cap exempt H1, which is you don't have any caps. You can apply H1 anytime and you have unlimited H1s for people who work in hospitals, right? But if you work for a company, you have to go through the lottery system. And the bad thing with the lottery system is that because it's random, you essentially have to leave it to chance. So if you don't get it in that lottery, if your H1B doesn't get picked in the lottery, you have essentially 3 years, right? Three chances. If you are still in OPT, by the way, right? Because if you are done with your OPT, you need H1 to be in US. So while you are in your OPT period, you can apply. You can keep applying for H1, hoping that your H1 will get picked. But in because of bad luck, if your H1B doesn't get picked the first time, or the second time, or the third time, then you have to leave the country, or you'd have to switch back to a student visa or some other O1 or some other visas, right? So you can't live in the country if you already have a job and you used up your OPT. So that's a big disadvantage. But say your H1B got picked. Um, Even then, H1B is supposed to be only for 6 years. Let me explain. So each H1B visa is valid for 3 years and you can extend it only once if you are working for profit or non-profit. Once you use up your 6 years, you either have to have your green card process started to be able to extend your H1 beyond 6 years, or you have to leave the country for a year and then your clock will reset and then you can come back and do another 6 years of H1, which is obviously not very practical. So either you have to get your green card started, process started, which also, by the way, your employer has to start your green card process. You can't apply for green card on your own, except if you have a PhD and you have very good publications and you're on the top of your field. You cannot self apply for a green card. So your employer has to not only pay for your H1, but they also have to pay for your green card, which is a substantial commitment for them, right? Um, Even then, Donald Trump recently has changed rules. I mean, not him, but his administration has changed rules. Previously, how it used to be is that if you get an H1 and you're extending your H1, right, for 3 more years or beyond that, if you have a green card in process, they used to just approve your application because it's the same position, it's the same employer, you already got your H1 before. But the rules have been changed last year. So even if you're extending your H1 for the same position, it's treated as a new H1. So every time you send in your H1 application, every 3 years you send in your H1 application, it's treated as a new application, right? It doesn't matter if you're cap dependent or cap exempt. Your H1B application is treated as a new application. And it doesn't matter how many times you had it before, how many times it was approved for you before. Like 10 years, 15 years, 20, it doesn't matter, right? So they still consider your application as new and it might get rejected. As you can see, it's devastating, right? So you cannot do anything, or you can't start a family, for example. You can't buy a house, or you can't settle in with this lingering doubt in your mind of whether your H1B will be extended or not in the future. So that's a big question mark that you will have in your life until you get a green card. And going to green card process, that's a whole different kind of mess, right? So the green card process, there's different layers, of course, different levels of green card applications, but typically, excuse me, if you come for masters, you apply for green card under what it's called an EB2, which is employment based 2. And if you have a bachelor's or higher, no masters, then it's employment based 3. Because of the way that the immigration laws are set up in US, for people for coming from India or China, China is a little bit better, but people coming from India, they currently have a wait time of over 100 years. So if you're a new student coming to US and you eventually going to apply for a green card through your employer, you would have to wait 100 years or more. In my case, I applied for my green card way back in 2014, thinking that I will get it by 2019. But apparently it will take me another 50 more years to get my green card. So until you get your green card, you would have to keep renewing your H1 every 3 years. And because of change in the rules last year, each of your renewals will be treated as a new H1, right? So which is bad. And that's a big question mark that you have in the back of your mind. So I was on H1 for around 8 years, and then I've decided, you know what, like this is not going anywhere because I have to keep renewing my H1. And also, by the way, if you have to switch jobs to a new employer, they will have to apply for your H1B again, and they will have to reapply for your green card, right? So they have to start the green card process again. Mind you, your date will not change. So if you already applied for a green card, you can port your date to your new green card application, but they still have to go through different process, that all the processes that the employer has to go through to sponsor your green card, right? Which is also not feasible. So you either are stuck with one employer for 50 or 60 years, or you take a risk and switch employers, hoping that you will get your H1, and then the employer will be willing to sponsor for a green card for you, right? So I was like, you know what? Even though my job in US was so good, my coworkers are amazing, and I loved living in Chicago. I decided, you know what? This is the time. Um, like I have to decide what to do with my life. And I was single, by the way, at that time. I had no family, so I was like, this is the right time for me to move to Canada. So this was back in 2017, 2016, 2017, when I heard about Canadian PR process, right? It's called Express Entry, and it's very straightforward, especially if you're living in US already, or if you're living anywhere in the world, and if you're what they call highly skilled immigrant. If you have a bachelor's or a master's and you're relatively young, which is assuming 40 years or less, you have good work experience, say 4 to 5 years or more, and your English skills are pretty good, which is you have to give the IELTS exam, and hopefully you can get more than 7.5 in all of the reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So if you fall within this category of a person, then it's very straightforward and very easy for you to immigrate to Canada using Express Entry as a PR, right? So I thought about it this way. I'm like, you know what? I could either live in US on H1 for 50 to 60 years and have this question in back of my mind of whether my H1 will be approved or not every 3 years, or I should say like, okay, screw this, I'm going to move to Canada and see how like, and then be a PR, and then not have this sort of this limbo in my life, right? So I decided to do it. So it took me around 6 to 7 months. Which is very short, by the way. I have to give the exam, IELTS exam. I have to apply. I have to submit a ton of documentation, but it's not that difficult. Anyone can do it. And we just have to prepare very well for that English exam. If you can score about 8 or 7.5 in all of the sections, then you can easily get it, assuming you are young, which is less than 40 years of age, right? And if you have families, it might be harder for you because you have a kid or you have a wife who has a job there. So it might be a little harder for you to move your entire family to Canada. But if you're single, then it's relatively straightforward because you don't have any real ties except your friends, of course, right, in USA. So I moved to Canada in 2018, which is last year. So in 2017, I applied for my PR through Express Entry, and then I moved to Canada in 2018. Um, and the life as a Canadian PR is actually pretty good. So there are multiple options here, right? So if you have a good IT job, information technology, like IT related job, like programmer, anything to do with computer programming or IT related jobs, then maybe you can convince your employer that you could work remotely from Canada because you have a Canadian PR. That would work. In my case, I come from a science background, so I had to apply for jobs here while I was doing my PR process, and I got a job, fortunately. So by the time I moved to Canada, I already had a job, which is very rare, I heard from other immigrants who moved to Canada. So typically, you have to move to Canada and then start searching for your job. So that's a different video. If you want me to talk about the process of Express Entry and searching for jobs and all that, let me know in the comments, and then I will make a different video. But the benefits as a PR is that you don't need a visa. You can live in this country and do whatever job you want, or not do any job if you can support yourself, and live indefinitely in this country, right? And not only that, you can also sponsor your spouse for PR if she hasn't applied with you, he or she hasn't applied with you. You can sponsor them, and you can also sponsor your parents for PR after 3 years in Canada, right? So it gives you a peace of mind. Your family can come with you as under green card, and it's a relatively short amount of time to get spousal PR. It's 1 year, I think. I'm sponsoring my wife now, and for parents too, it's just 1 year. So it's a relatively small time. And they all can come, and you can live as a family in Canada. So that's a very big benefit. And once you live in Canada as a PR for 3 years, you can also apply for citizenship, right? So which is a big benefit. A big benefit with Canadian citizenship is that there is a treaty called NAFTA, which allows Canadians to go and work in US on NAFTA visa. And NAFTA visa is not that difficult to get. If you have a job offer from a US employer, you can get NAFTA visa stamped at the border. The border agent will stamp the visa on your passport. And unlike H1B, you can indefinitely renew NAFTA visa as long as you have the job, right? So you don't have any cap, excuse me, you don't have um, any time limit. I mean, it's 2 years. NAFTA visa is for 2 years, but you can keep renewing indefinitely, right? There's no cap or there's no time limit like 6 years for H1. So that's a big advantage of having Canadian passport. So if you move to Canada and you think that, okay, Canada is not for you, it's too cold, it's too expensive, whatever, you can go back to US after 3 or 4 years after getting your Canadian passport. So that's one big advantage, right? So yeah, so that's the initial information on how life is as H1 and on Canadian PR from an immigration perspective, right? Not general life, but immigration perspective. So you can either decide to live in US under H1 for 50 to 60 years, having that question in your back of your mind, like, oh, am I going to get it next time? Am I not going to get it? Or you can move to Canada as a PR. And if you like Canada, you can live here forever. Or if you don't like living in Canada because of whatever reason, you can get Canadian passport and maybe you can go back if you want. So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope I was not ranting or rambling for too long. As I said in my first video, please let me know in comments if you have any more questions. And if you want me to make a video on the express entry process, job searching in Canada, or general life in Canada versus life in US, and if you're a student, if you're deciding between whether you want to go to US or Canada, let me know, or put some comments or questions in there, so I can answer your questions. Thank you guys. Bye.